In the 1840s and 1850s, Americans moved west in astonishing numbers. Native Americans noted with disdain that whites devoured the land like locusts. By 1860, 4.3 million settlers had moved west of the Mississippi River. Americans believed that it was their manifest destiny to exploit the entire continent. My name is John Haas, and I'm joined by Professor Wynn and Professor Jarrett. Today we are talking about moving west and the Mexican-American War. Professor Wynn, what were some of the characteristics of these people that were moving west? I mean, in comparison with other individuals that were living in the major cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York.
Well, at this time, the majority of the inhabitants in the large cities were primarily recent immigrants. And that's a stark contrast to those who were penetrating out west, primarily American-born, who've been living here for quite a while. And that was one of the big differences. The other aspect was these were individuals and families who were looking for better economic opportunities that may have not existed in those perhaps urban areas. So economic opportunities were also a major characteristic of those coming out west.
Well, there's also a big contrast when you talk about the territorial expansion in the United States. You know, we sort of have ideals like the Oregon Trail and the young family trying to find a homestead. But you got to remember, in the South, it was often the wealthier landowners who were the first to pioneer developing new areas. And these were large, cotton planters, people who owned hundreds of acres already, often owned dozens or even hundreds of slaves. And they were reproducing their economic system as well as they moved west.
When you start to think about these people moving west, when you hear that slogan all over, manifest destiny, and you kind of wonder whose manifest, destiny is it? We had people that were Spanish, we had Mexicans that were living out there, we had Native Americans that were out there. We seem to kind of applaud ourselves, that is the white settlers that are moving out there, about how self-sufficient they are, how independent, resourceful. Indeed, the people in the East would talk about these individuals as being, half man, half alligator. So what is this concept of manifest destiny?
It's simply the belief that many Americans had during this period that God meant for them, meaning white Americans, to control the entire continent. And they pointed to the fact that thus far, every time white English-speaking Americans had tried to take land, they'd gotten it. And then they'd said, well, that's because God wants us to have it. Whereas the people who lived there already, the native people, the Spanish and Mexicans, were inferior. On the one hand, they weren't trained in the arts of agriculture and industry. They weren't exploiting the land properly. And on the other hand, they were spiritually and intellectually inferior. Protestant Americans saw Catholics as believers in a corrupt religion. They saw Native people and Catholics both as incapable of self-government. And so if democracy was God's chosen form of government, then it would require the Anglo-Americans to bring that form of government and self-rule to the rest of the continent.
I heard you say something. It's almost as if you'd mentioned that God whispered into the ear of the white man alone. I mean, what about the Mexican God or the Spanish God?
They didn't believe in the legitimacy of that.
Was there any rationale? I mean, was there, taking people's land? Are you getting at the point by uplifting these individuals that it was okay to take the land, that because our civilization was superior,
yes,
it was okay to come out there and grab that?
But gentlemen, the reality was America really far superior? Weren't the first settlers out there, they couldn't even know how to grow crops properly because they were trying to bring items from east and thought that, well, if it worked back home, it would work out west, when the reality was that it didn't. How about this notion of cowboys, this stereotype of cowboys? Well, the first real cowboys were of Mexican descent who taught Anglos, whites, that trade. So this notion you talk about of America truly being self-sufficient, I think is somewhat flawed. We have to think about that. In the impact, you mentioned the dynamic interplay between Native Americans, Mexicans, and everybody else who was out there. So the notion of manifest destiny, this unique American institutions, we have to ask ourselves, was it really that unique?
As people, and I think that's an excellent point, as we start to move in certain areas, we realize that the Spanish first, but then the Mexicans had the problem of not having too many people up in the northern part of their territories, and in the 1820s and 1830s starting to invite Americans to come over, sometimes buying land with as little as 3 cents an acre. Mm-hmm. What happened here?
Well, that's one of the great mistakes in history. The newly independent government of Mexico looked north, and they saw they had a very large border that was undefended and very expensive to send soldiers up there to defend it. They were worried about the Americans on the one hand and the Indians on the other. Those were their big threats on the frontier. So the solution was, we'll invite people to move there, and we'll give them the land, essentially, in exchange for their loyalty to our government. What the settlers, who were mostly Anglo-Americans, came from the United States, had to promise was they had to convert to Catholicism, and they had to obey the laws of the Mexican government, which included an abolition of slavery. That's part of the Mexican Constitution.
Oh, let me pick up. You just mentioned the abolition of what was growing in Texas that was so important for Americans.
Well, it was land to grow cotton. That's what most of the settlers wanted to do. They saw what had been done in other places like Mississippi. They wanted to reproduce that economic system in Texas. And so despite what they'd promised when they accepted the land, they brought their slaves with them. They did not, go to Mass or get their children baptized in Catholic churches. Instead, they set up a system that was familiar all across the South of cotton agriculture. Mm-hmm. And they proceeded to try to undermine the Mexican government and seek their independence from Mexico.
Yeah. In 1836, as you well know, at the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texans won their independence in 1836, and yet they don't come in until 1845. What was going on? Why did it take 9 years for Texas to come into the Union?
Well, there was a big problem. The people in the North and the South were already at loggerheads about slavery. And there was no question that if Texas, which was technically an independent country, the Lone Star Republic at that point, if Texas had come into the Union, it would come in as a slave state and would upset the balance that had been established in the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Yeah. So that's what postponed the admission of Texas as a state.
Yeah, Professor Wynn, as you know, in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we paid $15 million for about 1/3 of Mexico's land. And I think on the surface it would look wonderful, very much like the Louisiana Purchase, that we got so much for so little. But in doing that, did we spread slavery? And was ultimately that our undoing? The more we grab in America, the more potent the force is for our own undoing.
Absolutely. Ultimately, you have Texas, the large amount of land that potentially is going to come into our grasp, and it will come in under the realm of America. And now you have further expansion of land for this institution of slavery, which is now going to be a predecessor for 10, 15 years down the road, where America is going to erupt in the Civil War here.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a Wilmot Proviso in 1846, where the kind of the cockiness of Americans, where David Wilmot of Pennsylvania says Americans are easily going to win the Mexican-American War, and any land that is taken from Mexico or any land we purchase, that there will be no extension of slavery. And immediately John C. Calhoun says, I'll take my slaves anywhere I damn well please. And although the Wilmot Proviso did not pass, I think you really get the understanding that this is kind of a lightning rod. This is kind of a yardstick of where America is right now, that you got all these people saying, we're going to win this war. When we do, we won't have an extension of slavery. And, John C. Calhoun saying, I'll take my slaves anywhere. And as you said, we're talking, 15 years before the eruption of the Civil War. Is that a correct assessment?
Sure, yeah. And I want to back up a little bit because I think we just skipped over the U.S.-Mexico War. And from a perspective, many Mexicans and Mexican-Americans see it as a war where the United States stole, and I beg to correct you here, 55% of Mexico's territory. And the premise on which that war started was a very slender one, because after Texas, which had been an independent state, had become a state in the United States, entered the Union, there was a dispute over where the southern border was, whether it was along the Rio Grande or along the Nueces River. And President Polk was deliberately provocative. He sent the army into the disputed region. Eventually, the Mexican army took the bait and fired on some American troops there, and that led to the declaration of war with Mexico. But of course, it wasn't just a border dispute, because for years the Americans had been pushing Mexico to sell them New Mexico and California. And so once the American army had marched on Mexico City and on California, they demanded in the peace settlement that they get the territory that they'd gone after.
The majority of Americans in the 19th century believed that it was their manifest destiny to spread across the continent. The war with Mexico was won relatively easy, and new lands were now opened up for would-be settlers. In a mere 4 years, James K. Polk had nearly achieved everything he had hoped for. The question is, at what cost? We'll see you next time at My History Lab.